the Bhagavad-Gita, as you said, is a small part of a much larger work. And what we have here is a very selective, a very small portion of it. But the whole thing is not that much. Honestly, this is the full translation right here. Same translator, so they're not playing around with it. This is not all that much. And look, it's written like a poem. So you could honestly rip through this in the span of an evening pretty simply. Although many people spend, their whole lives reading it. It's got that many layers to it. The full work is entitled the Mahabharata. I'm going to butcher all pronunciations as usual, so don't hold me to that. Mahabharata is a much longer work. It is, I think, let me think, I have a note here. The longest epic poem known at about 1.8 million words, roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. So, that's a good year of your life, just drifting through that every night, and probably more than a year. The Gita is one small passage within that, and it was added on fairly late. All of these things should be viewed as collective authorship over many generations. Mahabharata, I believe it was first begun at roughly the same time, a little bit after the time of Homer, and it evolved, a couple of little anecdotes here, a couple there. It begins as oral and moves on. And just over many, many centuries, people are adding to it and fleshing it out and developing it and changing it and adapting it. The Gita comes in somewhere between, I think, the 4th century BCE and the 4th century CE. So that's roughly 800 years of slowly accreting. And so it covers many different social periods and contexts that are important for the consideration of it, but it really stands outside of any specific social anchor. So we can't go into it too deeply on that, although I'm kind of going to in certain respects. As Maheya pointed out, the setup is fairly simple. There is a war going on among family members for power. It's not an unfamiliar theme. It breaks down to one group of cousins fighting another group of cousins over a power-sharing agreement that the one group thinks the other group has betrayed. Essentially, they had a contract, and now everybody's trying to renegotiate it. The moment here is really quite dramatic, where you have both sides lined up for battle on this huge field. And you can see one side on one side of the field, a little hilltop over there, looking across and seeing the opposing side on another hill. And pretty soon they're going to swarm down into the valley and begin to slaughter one another, all for political power. And Arjuna, one of the princes of the Pandava side, is struck. He looks up and he feels torn. He's not sure what to do. In chapter 1, on my page 1279, line 26, and there the son of Prithra saw rows of grandfathers and grandsons, sons and fathers, uncles, in-laws, teachers, brothers, and companions, all relatives and friends of his in both of the assembled armies. And seeing them arrayed for war, Arjuna, the son of Kunti, felt for them a great compassion as well as great despair, and said, "O Krishna, now that I have seen my relatives so keen for war, I am unstrung, my limbs collapse beneath me, my mouth is dry, and there is a trembling in my body, and my hair rises bristling." What's happening here? Sure.
So when he sees his family members, he felt like, how can they are so excited for like going on a war with me when I really care for them? And how can I even kill them? Is it really worth for me to kill all the people I love? And then is it gonna make sense for me to get that kingship? And who else is gonna be with me? Like, you're losing all your family members and then you are gaining whatever you were supposed to gain. But is that gain that worth than losing all the people you love? So he's in that dilemma of the moment. And like as he says, like, my limbs collapse beneath me, my mouth is dry. I mean, he just doesn't know what to do at this moment.
Yeah. At this moment, he is supposed to go and kill his family members. I mean, who among us hasn't wanted to do that from time to time? But he's having a moral crisis. He looks and he sees all these people and he's remembering, okay, I remember spending that summer afternoon at his house. Played with my cousins. That was great. I see old teachers up there, people who have, spent hours with me, trying to get me to understand things, and now I'm supposed to go and bash that head in. I am unstrung, my limbs collapse beneath me, and my mouth is dry. There is a trembling in my body, my hair rises, bristling. Why is he recording physical phenomena? These are physical details. He's talking about a moral quandary, but he's discussing it in physical terms. Why? Any thoughts? What's that? He's trying to show more human-like emotions? Show whom? The reader? Maybe. Let's wipe this. Okay, there you go. Maybe.
I also think because he's in pain right now, so it's whenever we are really in pain, body expression also kind of goes along with that. Like, what are you feeling in mind? It comes out. Okay. So by giving this detail to the old blind king, he is showing, okay, that's what is happening exactly. That's how he is frightened there. Because those detail will help him understand the situation. And also as a reader, as he mentions, I think as a reader we can feel the pain as well. Not only he himself feeling the pain, but we can actually visualize, okay, this is the situation. That's how he's feeling actually at this moment.
So there's a couple of things going on with that. Number one, you're saying, and I agree, that the emotional state is kind of the leading factor here. The emotional state is agitated, and so it is manifesting itself in physical terms. The emotion is unstable, and so his body becomes unstable. But it is also the case that the reader and really anybody who is watching would have no idea about that emotional state unless it manifests itself in physical form. You know, I'm looking out at a crowd of people who may or may not want to kill me right now. The only way I would have to understand that is if, you know, you were sitting there sharpening a knife or loading a gun. That would give me a hint that I'm really getting on your nerves. Other than that, it's just a blank wall. And I have to assume you're not trying to kill me. Here, you see that moral hesitation having real consequences in the world. And this is kind of the crux of what this piece is doing or trying to do. The physical symptoms are an indication of a greater conflict. He is not just seeing his own problems also, but he's immediately extrapolating it. On page 1280, line 31, all inauspicious are the signs that I see, O handsome-haired one. I foresee no good resulting from slaughtering my kin in war. So he's automatically extrapolating. He's going from, I have some qualms about killing my family, and he's pushing that towards a more general conclusion of saying nobody should have to do that. What is the good of this? Does it have any universal meaning? I have no wish for victory, nor for a kingship and its pleasures. O Krishna, what good is kingship? What good even life and pleasure? For those whose sake we desire kingship, pleasures, and enjoyments are now drawn up in battle lines, their lives and riches now abandoned, fathers, grandfathers, sons, grandsons, my mother's brothers, and the men who taught me in my youth, brothers and fathers-in-law, kinsmen all. Though they are prepared to slay us, I do not wish to murder them, not even to rule the three worlds, how much less one earthly kingdom. He's stepping back from his tribal identification with his side. And to his credit, he is considering everybody. And he's couching it in an abstract sense of ethical values. But look where it goes. So we cannot in justice slay our kinsmen. This is a little bit further down on 1280. We cannot in justice slay our kinsmen, Dhritarashtra's sons, for having killed our people. How could we be pleased, O Mandava? Even if they, mastered by greed, are blind to the consequences of the family's destruction, of friendships lost to treachery, how are we not to comprehend that we must turn back from evil? The wrong done by this destruction is evident, O Shaker of Men, for with the family destroyed, its eternal laws must perish. And when they perish, lawlessness overwhelms the whole family. So now he's talking about something much broader than his own feelings. And here I think it helps to understand the perspective that he's coming at here. What's he saying with, for with the family destroyed, its eternal laws must perish? What does that mean to anyone?
More of like when you have siblings and stuff like that, when you have like this families broken down, connection between family members broken down also.
Sure.
That's something like that.
If you grow up knowing that, well, you know, murdering your family is okay, you know, the dinner table is going to be a little more fraught when you're growing up. You're going to be a little less likely to, you know, tease your little brother. It creates a sense of distrust. But on a broader scale, it undermines more than just the family dynamic, because the family can be seen as representative of the society as a whole. And here it helps, without getting too crazy, to just remember that what we're dealing with is a kind of rigidly stratified social order. The caste system, C-A-S-T-E, where you stay largely among your own kind. Each group has their special role in society, and there's not a lot of movement among them. The top of the heap would be the priests, the Brahmins, then you go down to the warrior caste, Kshatriyas, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, and then sort of the middle class, the Vyasyas, whatever, and then the Sudras are the bottom, which are the servants, necessarily. Those are all very general, but these are the big categories. And this is the social order that they're working with. Arjuna is pretty clearly among the warrior class. He is a warrior at this moment. Who is writing this text, most likely, though? The servants? Very likely, all reading was being done by priests or people of that caste. They are the scholars. They are the intellectuals. They are the theologians. They are people with a fairly tight lock on access to literature. Michelle, is that a stretch or a hand? Okay, I know. So when Arjuna starts talking about the breakdown of the social order, this is what he's talking about. He's talking about things getting confused. Once you undermine an ethical basis for a social order, the social order seems to splinter, or is at least in danger. And this comes into, I would say, sharpest relief in the verse where I left off in this, which is now on my page 1281, verse 41. Overwhelmed by lawlessness, the women of the family are corrupted. From corrupted women comes the intermingling of classes. They're always stirring up trouble. But the most dire example of this that this poet can reach for is what? It says it right there. The last 4 words out of my mouth. The intermingling of classes. Dun, 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 dun. That is the worst possible outcome from this perspective. Now again, whose perspective are we really reading this from? The priests. The priests are on what end of this pyramid, shall we say? The top. Historically speaking, who likes any social order the most?
People on the top.
The people on the top. The 1%. Damn them. They have an interest in very real terms of saying that you don't want to mess with the social order because, well, you know, that'll disproportionately cost us. Everybody else might get reconfigured a little, and they might be able to move around a little bit more, but we don't want that because that's all coming out of our pocket. So there's that dynamic playing out here, and it's important to bear this in mind. But reducing it to that would be a mistake. That's something I want to lay down and make sure everybody's aware of. But this is not just a political or propagandistic document here. There's a lot more going on here. And it should be seen in certain power structure concepts. But the fundamentals go way beyond that. Those who destroy the family, who institute class mingling, cause the laws of the family, the laws of the caste to be abolished. Men whose familial laws have been obliterated, O Krishna, are damned to dwell eternally in hell, as we have often heard. You know, you pull out the hell and people get scared. It grieves me that as we intend to murder our relatives in our greed for pleasures, kingdoms, we are fixing on doing evil. If the sons of, whatever that name is again, armed as they are, would murder me weaponless and unresisting, I would know greater happiness. And having spoken, Arjuna collapsed into his chariot, his bow and arrows clattering, and his mind overcome with grief. I'm sitting this one out. And you're just going to plop down, say, nope, I'm not going to fight. Which is essentially the same situation that Achilles does in the Iliad. It's a common refrain to a certain degree throughout the ancient world. And here you have another iteration of that and trying to see, well, what is the proper response for this? Because all of this is really about studying behavior and, in large part, recommending certain behaviors. None of this is, I hate to burst anybody's bubble, none of this stuff is real. Nobody actually thinks this happened in any substantive way. These stories are all to draw an example and for people to study and wonder, well, you know, how would I act in a similar situation? Or what laws of behavior can we extract from this to guide us in life? But look at, again, I love beginnings and endings. And again, you can't really judge in heavily excerpted stuff what is a beginning and what is an ending. But look where these editors chose to end this excerpt in this chapter. the last words to come out of my mouth again? Grief. Not just grief, but what's the whole line? And my mind overcome with grief. That's curious. Your mind is thought. Grief is what? Feelings, emotions. And we see a familiar split between reason and emotion. He is thinking one thing, he's feeling another. He is thinking, well, it is my job at this point to go and kill my relatives. Of course, the word for that, as Maheya said, is dharma, which is roughly your duty, the ethics behind that duty, it's law, it's a fairly broad term that we don't need to go into too narrowly. But what he is trying to find in this crisis is his own dharma, his own sense of what should I do in this moment. What is the proper observance of dharma? And he is saying, my mind is overcome with grief. The emotionalism is driving his decision-making right now. His mind, his sense of reason, isn't even really a factor. He cannot judge what is proper dharma because he is too torn with seeing all of these faces arrayed on both sides that are about to come together and slaughter one another. He doesn't want to be a part of that. He knows it's going to be emotionally difficult for him. And he can't get to a point where he sees any reason for this to happen, for him to take part in this. It might happen, but maybe he doesn't have to be part of it. Maybe he can just sit it out, recuse himself. But you can see the dynamics of the argument laying out in very specific terms, terms we have seen before. Chapter 2, my page 1282. The Lord, now he's talking to his friend Krishna. Krishna, as Maheya pointed out, is the Lord, the god Vishnu, who has taken a side in this war. Again, it's not hard to see an analog in the Greeks where different gods took sides. This is not exactly analogous because Vishnu is arguably more powerful in the pantheon than really any of the Greek gods except Zeus. But, you know, he's not only taking a side in the war, but he's joining sides and everybody knows it. The Greeks would at least, you know, take on disguises and hide themselves when they're helping out someone. Here, he just takes the form of Krishna and he goes and he mingles with the Pandavas and everybody's, oh yeah, well yeah, he's a god. We know, he's with us, you know.
He doesn't believe it to my hand.
The relationship is complicated, but he is seen as a guide. And in fact, it can be argued that he is, as the charioteer of Arjuna, he is the religious core of the culture, literally leading the warrior cult, the warrior caste. So in response to this, although the Lord said, although you seem to speak wisely, seem to, what does seem mean?
You kind of do.
Kind of do? It appears you do. You seem something. You have an outward appearance of making sense. And, you know, and I love the delicacy of the treatment. When somebody says, well, you seem to speak wisely, what they're really saying is, but you're actually an idiot. Believe me, I get this look all the time. You seem to know what you're talking about, but really, let's be honest. You have mourned those not to be mourned. The wise do not grieve for the gone, or for those who are not yet gone. There was no time when I was not, nor you, nor those lords around us, and there will never be a time henceforth when we shall not exist. What's he talking about here?
Oh, he's talking about the soul.
The soul, reincarnation. The core belief of the Hindu tradition that the body is essentially the metaphor they use a lot in here is like a clothing. You come down, you put on a new body, mix it up for a little while, then those clothes are no longer in fashion, you're off. The body falls away, you come back in a later stage in a different physical presence.
Yeah, he was saying that it is not born on the section 20.
Mm-hmm.
So he's saying that it is not born, nor it is ever mortal, and having been will not pass from existence. So like, if you have birth, you're gonna die, but then if you die, you again gonna born, because it's just like changing, like the way you say, he also mentioned changing their clothes.
Flesh is just a temporary container, if you will. And so death has relatively little consequence. You're just going to come back. It's going to be different, but you're not destroying anything by killing someone. Try that argument in a court of law if you kill your family, but you know. Contacts with matter by which we feel heat and cold, pleasure and pain are transitory, come and go. Those you must manage to endure. Which isn't a comforting calculation here. You must manage to endure your physical presence. This is something that is a task. This is something that is onerous, something that is in times painful, but it will all fall away. And then eventually, through many reincarnations, perhaps you will break out of this cycle of reincarnation if you finally get things right, and you can be released into the universe as pure spirit. And not keep getting drafted into another tour of duty here. So Krishna is here trying to put Arjuna's qualms into perspective. Saying, all right, you know, you feel a certain way now, that's great. Your emotional instability is leading to physical instability, and I'm here to tell you that your physical instability is temporary and ultimately pointless, because what we really want to focus on is the emotion anyway, or the soul.
I like the section 27 that he says, death is assured to all those born, and birth is assured to all those dead.
Yeah. Death is assured to all those who are born, birth is assured to all those dead. You should not mourn what is merely inevitable consequence, which is a beautiful idea. And you know, when you lose someone you love, it's comforting to think, well, you know, they'll be coming back, or they're not really gone to begin with. They're just released. And they're no longer burdened with, that uncomfortable physicality that, let's face it, especially as we see friends and family get older, the body becomes a burden. It was just about a year ago now that I gave a midterm exam for my Sunday class, and then I drove out to a facility where my father was staying. He had been very sick. He had an aortic, a valve on his heart had been replaced about 8 years earlier, and it was failing. And we were told that he probably, if he had replacement surgery again, it would not go well, or probably not go well. And so on this night, I went out because I knew what was happening. We had been told a couple of months earlier what was the trajectory. And I sat there and I watched him. And he was gasping for breath, and everything was failing. And you just sit there and you stare and you see, people you love being tortured by their own bodies as it falls away. And it's a beautiful thought to say, just move on. The body is, nothing. Let it fall away and reveal what is inside the soul. It's a beautiful thought. Following that line, beginnings are unmanifest but manifest the middle state, and ends unmanifest again. So what's your complaint about? What does that mean? It's complicated. This is another fine point of theology, the study of divinity, the study of gods and religion, that I think is further indication of who was writing this and what audience they were anticipating. Because essentially what this verse is, beginnings are unmanifest but manifest the middle state, and ends unmanifest again. So what is your complaint about? This is a very fine point of theology.
So it was saying whatever beginning of something was it's not expressed, and when it is there, you've been exposed to it, and then after it's gone, it's no longer exposed. So why are you complaining?
Right. There's a sense of invisibility and visibility here. There's a sense of the transitory nature of life here. There's a sense of perspective, this one little snapshot in time doesn't matter in the big picture. But it is one of those little fine points that it would take somebody fairly well educated in theology and ethics and just literature in general, the process of digging through this stuff and finding meaning, that gives us a sense of who is writing this, who is reading this stuff, and what it really is, what agenda it's really trying to push. But it's also contrasting. So what is your complaint about? It's contrasting this fairly esoteric idea that is a little bit of a puzzle, which when I get to this, it always sort of bucks me and says, well, all right, can I figure this out? Am I smart enough to figure this out? I'm confused reading it. And I always try and gauge and be honest about my own level of confusion. If something just appears to me and I can't make sense of it automatically, I start to think, well, why? Why would they deliberately try and push me back from this? Why can't they just make sense to me? Why can't they speak on my level? Now I understand completely what. So what is your complaint about? Because suddenly that brings it down to an immediate reference that, okay, yeah, I understand that. So in the span of this one little verse, they're addressing very celestial, conceptual, idealized notions of religion and ethics, and then contrasting that in that last line, saying, but what's it to you? He's pointing out, I would say, Krishna is pointing out a bit of a split lens here, where there is this ideal frame, these higher level thoughts. But what do you care? That's not for you. You can't follow me. You're just a warrior. You're, great and regal and everybody loves you, yada, 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 yada. But let's keep things in perspective. You're not necessarily the same level of refinement, intellect, blessedness as those of us at the top, the Brahmins. They pursue this a little further, and they start to get into the ethical heart of the dilemma. On my page 1284, the one cannot ever perish in a body and inhabits of descendants of Bharata, and so no being should be mourned, which is kind of what they were saying earlier. What's the point of mourning someone who's not really dead? Just their body is. But they're still drifting around with us. Nor should you tremble to perceive your duty as a warrior. And here he's getting very explicit. Your duty, your dharma as a warrior. For him there is nothing better than a battle that is righteous. So now we're getting even more specific. Your military duty is an expression of righteousness. And if by chance they will have gained the wide open gate of heaven, O son of Prithra, warriors rejoice in fighting such as that. If you turn from righteous warfare, your behavior will be evil, for you will have abandoned both your duty and your honored name. So war is suddenly an imperative of Dharma. Not just some abstract concept that you're trying to link up, but it is the core of what he, as a warrior, is supposed to do. So it's not just about trying to match up your particular mission with some notion of Dharma. No, Dharma demands you fight, no matter what. The consequences be damned. It could be against your family, your cousins, and let's face it, we all have that cousin we wouldn't mind knocking off. But maybe even closer family. If it is your duty to kill your brother, your mom, your dad, your children, your duty is your duty. And that is the overriding concern.
I don't know the social structure you're talking about, like you cannot break the social structure, you have to be that social structure.
From a structural argument of the society, you need people at the top especially, need people to do what they're supposed to do. It's no accident that one of the more famous quotations from this book comes to us from a scientist named J. Robert Oppenheimer, who worked on the Manhattan Project, which developed in the mid-20th century the atomic bomb. And it was a lot of scientists working on that, nuclear physicists, experts who were given a problem on how to harness this huge energy, and given a goal of we want to develop this for a weapon to end World War II. And they just sat there and they did the math. They focused on their job. And when they came up with the bomb and they saw what scale of devastation it could have, one of the Oppenheimer, one of the chief scientists, very famously wrote at one point, he quoted the Bhagavad, saying, I am the destroyer of worlds, which is a line from Krishna later on, where he says, we did our job irrespective of the moral consequences. We sat there and added up numbers, made very abstract calculations, harnessed the full scope of our scientific background and our capacity to push the boundaries of nuclear physics. We used all of that to kill millions of people. It's a sobering concept. Can you totally divorce an action from its consequences? There is a tradition of looking at that particular question that comes to be known as deontological ethics. An action has to be good in itself for it to be good, and you should consider it regardless of the consequences, which is nice, but it comes into sharp contrast with consequentialist ethics, which tends to be, well, no, an action is good if it has a positive outcome, and we judge an action based on what happens as a result, its consequences. So when you see that word consequence get tossed out here, it's being done so in a very deliberate way. And they're trying to weigh, how should this be judged? Is Arjuna proper in sitting down and not fighting? Should we judge his actions by their consequence? There's a pretty good argument that, well, he's just going to sit down. He is one of, there are literally at this point, I believe, hundreds, if not thousands of people lining up ready to go and kill one another. I don't think they're all going to take their cue from him. Oh, Arjuna's not going to fight? Well, I'm not fighting. I don't think that's the case here. They're not necessarily waiting on it. I don't want to go there just yet. On my page 1286, they bore down into this a little bit further, and they start talking about another key idea here, which is renunciation. Essentially what Arjuna is doing is renouncing the war. He's refusing to take part in it. He's just going to sit alone and let it happen. This is a kind of withdrawing from the world that we see in a lot of social and religious contexts, especially in the ancient world, but certainly not exclusively. People will renounce concern with worldly things to try and achieve a more spiritual focus in their lives. The Catholic tradition of Lent does this. Buddhist monks will famously fast or be celibate or withdraw from earthly pleasures as a sign of devotion. And what Arjuna is doing is a kind of renunciation. He's saying, I'm not going to be a part of this. I'm going to withdraw. So when the Blessed Lord on page 1286 says, as I have previously taught, there are two paths, O blameless one. There is the discipline of knowledge and the discipline of action. Not by not acting in the world does one become free from action, nor does one approach perfection by renunciation only. So Arjuna is just renouncing, and Krishna is saying, well, that's not quite going to get you there. You're not necessarily good just because you won't join in. If you were a concentration camp Nazi guard who maybe didn't process, all your paperwork as quickly as you should have, maybe you slow walked certain things so that some people didn't die as quickly, are you as blamable for the catastrophe that you were still working for? A lot of people made that argument in the years after World War II. I was following orders, was the argument you heard at the Nuremberg trials. Well, how much renunciation does it take? Not even for a moment does someone exist without acting. Even against one's will, one acts by the nature-born qualities. He who has restrained his senses but sits and summons back to mind the sense objects is said to be a self-deluding hypocrite. But he whose mind controls his senses, who undertakes the discipline of action by the action organs without attachment, is renowned. What is that about? Anyone? Again, we're getting very abstract here. We're getting very complicated. It's dicey. The opposite of renunciation is attachment. Arjuna is attached to, his family, but also his feelings and his belief that his feelings should affect his actions. How can you divorce yourself from these things? Does it make sense to? Is it even possible? He is thinking in terms of, if I go and slaughter my family members, afterwards, I'll feel bad about that. He is clinging to that sensibility. He cannot break it. The demands that this is putting on him, perhaps they're unreasonable. Krishna is demanding a high level of ethical awareness from somebody who is, let's face it, at the very moment, he's going through a little bit of a crisis, and I think we can all see that Arjuna is doing a heroic job of enduring a ethics exam while he's sitting there in the middle of the battlefield, watching everybody sharpen their spears. Is it unreasonable to expect for Krishna to expect Arjuna to be motivated by this? Yes? How so? It's okay if you don't have a clear answer. It's a little bit abstract. It's very abstract.
Like, isn't it here saying like to control his mind and who is controlling and being disciplined, that they are better than like the people
Who can't?
yeah.
Yeah. You need to control your mind. So right now, here again, we have that split between reason and emotion. And he's saying, it is better, you need to control your mind. And by doing so, you are better than those who can't. Who can control their mind most of all? People on the top of that pyramid. Yeah. So that is the standard that he is holding there and holding everybody else to. You need to be more reasonable. You need to divorce yourself from the emotion of this moment. You need to, if possible, in your mind, separate the idea of, or separate your understanding of your actions from your understanding of their consequences. The consequences are not for you to consider. You only have your actions. That's where you should focus. And putting aside the philosophical gymnastics that you have to go through to really follow this line, it's not necessarily productive to lecture people who are having an emotional crisis that don't be so emotional. That doesn't necessarily solve the problem. But for his perspective, Krishna's perspective, that should be the problem. You just need to think about it a different way. Think about it like I do. And here, I want to reference a part that doesn't quite make it into the excerpt, but I think it's kind of critical. It is in this same chapter 8. He says, and so at all times meditate upon me, fight, O warrior, with mind and intellect fixed on me, you will attain me without doubt. With your ability to think, your ability to reason, you can reach my level of understanding. That sounds curious and somewhat familiar. And then verse 14, for one of never straying mind who constantly remembers me, for the yogi constantly yoked, I am quite easily attained. Easily attained. Is Arjuna having, it's not in the book. I'm reading a part that wasn't in the book. Sorry. I'm going to throw you a curveball every now and then. Krishna is saying, look at the world the way I do. It's very simple. You can get there. You just need to try a little harder. You just need to do what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to do it. And then, over time, let's not be impatient, but over time, you will reach my level. Isn't that nice? Set your sights on that goal. Set your sights on that big picture and just keep plugging at it. Come on, you can do it. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Think. Ignore all those pesky feelings that delude the commoners, the lower caste people. Focus on being like me. You can see the power dynamics here, right? You can see the Brahmins putting words in Krishna's mouth, saying, just listen to us. We do our job, you do your job, and everything will go along. Don't think about the consequences. Don't think about what's next. Don't think about other than the four corners of your duty. Do that, and everything will be fine. How does that work for people on the lower end of that scale, generally?
It is really interesting how Krishna is kind of saying that Arjuna is not like other people. He's not that low, but at the same time he puts a distance. He's not that hard to. He's kind of in the middle. And also Krishna kind of looks like a dictator, that makes people do what he wants, but I'm not thinking about the consequences, but it feels like he will put all of the blame on those people who perform the order afterwards.
Mm-hmm.
And also to add to her, the way he's saying your job is to just do it, not think what's gonna happen. So he's trying to not give him the chance to reason himself. He's saying they're gonna die regardless. You kill them today or not kill them now. But your duty, you cannot just step out of your duty.
Yeah. He's saying there's essentially two things. He's just saying that, okay, it is your job as a warrior to go and fight. And if you don't do that, you're not doing your job, which is a violation of bing, 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 Dharma. But the other thing he's saying is that he is placing a value judgment on those two choices. He's saying the difference between action and non-action is significant. He's saying there's really no such thing as non-action because refusing to do something is still doing something. It's refusing.
Yeah.
So Arjuna is trying to attain some level of ethical purity here where he says, well, I'm just not going to participate. And that will take me out of this moral quandary. But he's still there on the field. He's still there in the mix. There is no such thing as not being part of it. You cannot do that. So the emphasis is very much on giving Arjuna a simple binary choice. You join the fight and kill everyone, and that is good. If you don't, you are violating the core principle of Dharma, and that is bad. Killing your family is good. But he shouldn't get too concerned with it. He should act without attachment, is the phrase they use again. Act without attachment. Is that possible? Isn't it just ridiculous to assume that somebody can kill their family without feeling a little remorse? Maybe not about everyone. Again, we all have that cousin. But without attachment, without feeling bad about consequences, without worrying about potential consequences. Who can just isolate themselves and say, no, I need to do this? Who can? Isn't that inhuman? But that's what the Brahmins are encouraging. Strive for that. It helps also if you are in charge of a vast, vast civilization to have people who are willing to just do their duty, do what you tell them their duty is without thinking. You can do an awful lot then. You can achieve a lot if you could just get people to let go of their pesky little ethical quandaries. They're so selfish, wanting to balance their own thoughts about everything. The Blessed Lord said, this is my page 1288 again. The Blessed Lord said, know that the enemy is this, desire, anger, whose origins are in the quality of passion, all-consuming, greatly harmful, desire and anger. Emotions, emotionalism. I would say aggressive emotions. Perhaps the fuel that the Greeks would see as manifesting itself in the term eros. Those sorts of resentments that build up and lead you to lash out and violate social order and create chaos. Yeah. Emotionalism is always bad in this, because emotionalism can inspire people to do things that violate social order, that disrupt the calm functioning of the state. And if you're on the top of that pyramid, you do not want disruptions in the functioning of the state, because that is all beneath you, and that will seek to diminish your potential. As fire is obscured by smoke or by dust, a mirror's surface or an embryo by its membrane, so this is covered up by that. Knowledge is constantly obscured by this enemy of the wise, by the insatiable fire whose form, Arjuna, is desire, which is another word for attachment. You want something to happen. You want to get something. You want consequences that lead to you getting what you want. Your action is linked to consequences. When you act out of that, you are living too much for the consequence and not for the strict right or wrongness of your action. But again, that's almost a denial of human nature. They're asking you to reject desire. Desire is a fuel in human nature. And can anyone necessarily renounce desire entirely? Well, people try. I would say that we're still working on that as a species. How much can they live from the neck up? A lot of mistakes get made by misunderstanding this key aspect of humanity. They talk more about restraint, restraining your desires, restraining your ambitions, restraining your demand that your actions have specific consequences. On page 1290, just look at some of the words that jump out at you. And again, translation, words are going to be different, but just look at some of the words that I can see jumping out here. Temperate, has been subdued, free from all longing and desire, steadfast, restrained, mind undaunted, abandon all desires, restrained, under control, not thinking about anything, subdued. That's just me glancing down and picking out a few words here. It's not subtle. They are stressing that everybody should restrain themselves, which we see an awful lot of in the ancient world. This constant implication, this imprecation, that people restrain their desire. They restrain their ambition. They restrain any sense of wanting something specific, and they should just sit quietly and do what they have to do without worrying about breaking out of that. It's a philosophy of stability, of perpetuating a stable state. But imagine again where this might come from. Who would stress stability above all else, even staring down the inevitability of human nature? Who is going to make that case? The top people, but probably in a specific historical context. Now again, we don't know the specifics because this work evolved over many centuries. We don't know the specific context of it. But in this, when somebody is saying the most important thing is stability, that makes me think that they're not necessarily just because, maybe they're on top of the pyramid. But maybe the culture as a whole is coming from a period of some instability. You know, if everything was just smooth as silk for centuries and centuries, maybe people would be a little looser. Say, yeah, you know, stability's great, but hey, let's mix it up a little. But if, as we see in general throughout the ancient era, there is a civilization that is coming about after centuries, perhaps, of strife, of contention, of eras, of tribal warfare, disrupting any notion of social order or any notion of civilization itself. That's going to be the focus. People who are afraid of chaos will stress order. People who have order are less afraid of chaos. History proves this again and again and again. Quiet times tend to get superseded by tumultuous times. And then those people who live through the tumultuous times come up and say, okay, now the most important thing is we quiet things down again. We want stability. We want steadiness. We want basic fundamental structures in our lives that can keep the chaos we just came from, and we all really remember, from erupting again. And it helps to have stable, blank, unthinking warriors working for you in that effort. It's okay. Then at the end, what happens? What's the big reveal? Maheya suggested it earlier. What does Krishna do?
He helps him clear up his mind.
He helps him clear up his mind. He helps him understand his place in
And
this
also,
thing.
he comes up in his God form with all those hands and his...
Yes, he exposes himself. Ooh. He exposes himself in all of his divine majesty. Ugh.
And also Sanjay comes up there.
Don't go to Sanjaya just yet. Let's stick with Krishna. Krishna exposes himself as this enormous god. Which overwhelms Arjuna. Krishna, in fact, has to put a little double whammy on him so that his mind could take in the wonderment he would about to see, or his eyes would be able to process it even. And Arjuna begs, no, that's just too much. The glory and the power is overwhelming me. I can't handle it. Put the dimmers back on my eyes. Give me the shades. I'm not strong enough for this. Which is an overwhelming image of authority, of power. The idea that human beings cannot really process the scale of divinity.
I think he changes his eyes or does something, right?
Yeah, he's got a little double whammy or something that he puts on his eyes. But this is just a dramatic enactment of the argument he's been making all along, which is, Arjuna, you're a nice guy, but you're a dope. Do your job. Don't worry about the consequences. Don't worry about what's going to happen tomorrow. Your job is to go and fight. Your job is your entire Dharma. Don't get outside that. If it is your duty to go fight, then go and fight. And this text is used as an articulation of what is called the just war theory ever since, where people say, well, all right, what right do we have to go to war? Nations go to war for specific reasons, and they all have to cross this threshold of saying, do we have the right to do so? What is a good war? People are going to die in a war. War is going to have many, many unintended consequences. In many cases, the unintended consequences, the innocent bystanders, the civilian population suffer more than the militaries you are trying to defeat. How can that be moral? How can that be ethical? How can it be just? These are the questions that are being put out there, and Krishna is saying, it's not up to you. You don't have the capacity to take in all of that. You know who does? God. I am God. Leave it to me. Do your jobs as God tells you. And who generally is God speaking through? The Brahmas, the top of the pyramid, the authorities. So here we're right back with so many other things coming out of the ancient world. Aten, Gilgamesh to a certain degree, certainly the Greeks, where there is just an established hierarchy of authority. And your job is to stay within that hierarchy. And some things maybe you can't really deal with. Some of the finer points of this argument, quite frankly, leave me way back in the dust. I am not smart enough to keep up. So maybe I should just do my job and stick with what I know and not try and bump up against my own natural limitations, which of course are reflected in the social structure. At the end, Arjuna agrees. He emerges from this little chunk of this much larger epic as a kind of ideal king at this point, not just a warrior, but a king. Because he understands that he just needs to do what he's supposed to do. No more, no less. And that in itself is good. But think about this as well. This story is clearly set up to have readers identify with Arjuna. His emotional quandary is very becoming at the beginning. And we feel with him, we empathize, we sympathize, and we're drawn in and we're looking at the world like, yeah, would we want to go and slaughter our families? I feel that conflict. I'm there. And this story is trying to allay that fear a little bit. But just think about this. If, as Krishna argues, we should not be considered with consequences, we should just act within our narrow scope and do whatever we're supposed to do without considering consequences, because consequences are, in essence, bad. This story seems to be aimed at consequences, at teaching people how to behave, how to live, how to think, how to feel, how to understand the world around them. The whole notion of it is consequential. Can you have literature that ignores consequence? Can you have philosophy that ignores consequence? It's all aimed at having an effect, at having a result, at changing the way people behave or at least think. So there is a core, I don't want to say hypocrisy running through it. It's the same problem with most literature, but this makes the argument a little sharper, because it is trying to have, this text is trying to have an effect, is trying to change the way people behave or think. At the same time, it is arguing that you should not worry about effects.